All right, so thanks for joining us today, everyone. This is our part 3 of the Resilient Waters Solutions webinar series. Today we are talking about prioritizing for fish. We have a great lineup of speakers, really excited to hear them all today and have some good discussion afterwards. Yeah, I was just mentioning to the folks that were in, if you would like, you can go to the participants tab and rename yourself. In the participant screen, find yourself, hit the more button, add your organization, just so other people can see who's in the room. We'll get to a bit more housekeeping in a bit, but for now, just like to start by acknowledging that we are on the lands of the mainland Coast Salish First Nations, and I'd like to pass it over to Tribal Chief Tyrone McNeil of the Stolo Tribal Council to welcome us to these lands and waters this morning and start us off in a good way. Over to you, Tyrone.
Thanks, Dan. It's actually the Coast Salish, and appreciating everybody's open mind the last while and accepting that in one way or another, we've been here for quite some time, and our relation to the land and whatnot. And when we're traveling, we pay what we call respect to the host people's land. So appreciating the open-mindedness by you and others in doing that and allowing people like me just to provide a welcome. We're respecting that you whether you call it our traditional territory or tidal lands or our lands or whatever, it's just that simple recognition of respect of where you are, considering we've been here for so long. And I won't get into the technical aspect of it, just appreciating everybody taking the time to join us here today to talk about something that's of extreme interest to us, and looking for a really good presentations and conversation on how we can improve conditions for salmon in a flood strategy, of which we're directly involved with as well. So thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much, Tyrone. That's great. I'd also like to just take a moment to acknowledge that the hundreds of years of colonialism and systemic racism and their ongoing effects that harm First Nations, and particularly the disproportionate impacts of flooding of communities and cultural sites, the loss of salmon, and now COVID. Thankfully, flooding season seems to have passed without too much harm to the Lower Fraser First Nations this year. And add that the systems that have been designed to control water and flooding are born of a similar settler mentality that was designed to control Indigenous bodies, and the same mentality that forcefully and with violence displaced and bound First Nations on reserves purposefully in harm's way on floodplains. And as you can see by this map, most reserves are located on the floodplain of the Lower Fraser and at risk of flooding in any given year. And a recent paper I was reading calculates that 90% of reserve lands across Canada are in floodplains. So this is a cross-Canada issue. And also just add, I'm taking the time to say this because what I'm hearing from Indigenous people is that many of us white settlers are eager to move to reconciliation and quick to skip uncomfortable truths. And just to acknowledge that this is our history too, and a horrific one. And there is much work to be done by white people to remove barriers within and between white-led institutions, and perhaps more importantly, as Michelle Nahaney says, to confront the barriers in our own white bodies and in our own white histories first. So on behalf of Resilient Waters, I'd just like to say we are doing our best to listen and learn about how we can do this for ourselves and the project and the work that we're doing, and within the Lower Fraser region. And acknowledge that we will make mistakes and commit to doing better. So if you have any feedback or corrections or ideas about anything that I've just said, please do feel free to get in touch. With that, I just wanted to take us on to what we'll be talking about today. It's like I just disappeared for a little while. Sorry, everyone.
You're back.
Technical difficulties. That hasn't happened to me before, but here I go. I'll pick up where I left off. Hopefully you heard most of what I was saying there, but I'll just go over the webinar flow for today. We'll have a quick update from Resilient Waters that I'll give. Then we'll have presentations from our panelists, 10 minutes each, and then finish off with a Q&A session. A few points about using Zoom today. A quick note that the meeting is being recorded. You can rename yourself under the Participants tab. You can add your name and organization. And the chat box. So these are weird times. We acknowledge that it would probably be nicer to be in a room together to have these discussions. But in adapting to that, there are some advantages to being spread out across the digital landscape, so to speak. So if you would like, please do use the chat box. You can find it at the bottom of your screen, or for some of you, maybe at the top. There is a chat, and you can put anything in there. So repeat things that you like, that you've heard speakers say, share URLs and resources, ask clarifying questions. If you think you have an answer to the questions that are being asked, or clarifying questions, feel free to go ahead and answer those. And of course, feel free to have the cheeky side chats that you want to have with those people you don't maybe get to talk to anymore. So any questions on that, you can pop into the box, and I'm sure somebody will answer. So I just want to do run a quick little poll here to tell us a little bit about who's in the room with us today. So you'll have a little poll popping up in front of you now, I think. And please go ahead and vote on those. And I just realized I made a classic blunder. I did not include an other on the type of organization. So if you are an other kind of organization, sorry. Okay, we've got most of our results in now. So I will share the results. Hopefully you're all seeing that. So most of us here are in the Coast Salish lands here, First Nations. Yeah, a pretty good mix of types of organizations today. So I won't belabor that. And we'll carry right on. Quickly today, I had, for those of you that have joined past webinars with us, we have been using Slido to manage the Q&A. I think it didn't go the greatest last time, but we're gonna go for it one more time and see how it goes. So you can go to Slido using the link that I've just popped in the chat box, and that will be a place where we'll be collecting questions. We like to use it just because it gives people the feature of upvoting questions, and also choosing whether to be anonymous or not. Having said that, if you really dislike Slido, if you put the question in the chat box, then I will move it into Slido for you. So and just to be clear, using the Slido for the Q&A is kind of like asking some bigger questions. If it's a quick clarifying question to a speaker, then you're free to just put that in the chat box. But if it's kind of these bigger questions for multiple presenters, then please do go put that in the Slido. Okay, now on to a quick little update from Resilient Waters. So for those that aren't familiar with Resilient Waters, it is a relatively new project, and it's been launched with what is now called Makeway, which is a Vancouver-based Canada-wide charity and foundation. So it is being launched underneath that. We just got started in last October 2019, and we are really targeting the idea of supporting opportunities to improve flood infrastructure along the Lower Fraser to allow for fish passage and also to benefit communities. So we're working with Kerwood Lydell and Patrick Lilly, the salmon biologist there, Mike Pearson of Pearson Ecological, Watershed Watch Salmon Society, and we are currently funded by the BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund, as well as Pacific Salmon Foundation. Just a quick note that these webinars are, and this project in many ways, is largely inspired by the work of Watershed Watch Salmon Society and particularly the Connected Waters campaign that Lena Aziz runs. And if you are interested to dig into some more of some other aspects of this issue area, you can find this report. I'll pop the link to it in this chat box now. And that link, or that report has a lot of good material on technical aspects, governance and regulatory, funding mechanisms, and just intersector connections about this issue area and some of the solutions that people are working on. And we're trying to continue to advance that work as well. And then finally, so it's been a while since we've kind of identified the opportunities that we're tracking, that we're watching, that are pieces of flood infrastructure, be they floodgates and tide gates, or pump stations, or dikes. We are tracking about 25 opportunities pretty closely for upgrading to allow for fish passage and also to benefit communities, of course. So we do have these two maps, but I will also just quickly show you our online map. So we do have an online map now that you can navigate. Any of these colored dots that you click on will tell you a little bit more about the site and very briefly about what we are thinking would be useful to update those sites. Our study area carries over from Vancouver all the way to Hope, essentially. So yeah, please do feel free. You can find the map. I will just pop that link into the chat box as well in just a moment. Here we go. You know what? I'll pop it in later. Don't have it on hand at this very moment. Oh, an exciting update about our visualizations that we've been working on with the UBC Coastal Adaptations Lab. There is a student there, Nate Ross, who has been working with us to develop some basic animations to help describe some of these different features. So here we go. We have the dreaded top mount gate, maybe the worst of all the flood infrastructure pieces for salmon. And Nate has built for us quite a lot of different kind of models of different types of floodgates. This is just one of them, a self-regulating float gate, for instance, but we also have the side mount. We have like remote style gate, all sorts of things that we can use to help explain the problem and some of the solutions very quickly. For instance, then maybe in the same category of the top mounted gate, we've got the impeller pump. So just a quick little animation to show what is going on when a pump station turns on in some cases. And then two of the more popular solutions of pump styles, the Archimedes and the Bedford Hydrostall, just a quick demonstration of how those work. So we'll continue to work on those and make them a little more usable. If you do want access to any of these images or animations, then please do get in touch with me. And I'm happy to share them. And we probably will end up just sharing these more broadly on our website once they're a bit more ready to go. Finally, just a little note on why we are pursuing this kind of solutions webinar series. What we were finding in our research as we were preparing for this project is that there was little shared understanding, both locally and globally, I think, of how well solutions are or aren't working, and when. And also to create some connections, get some conversations going, and feature good work, both locally and around the world. So that's really why we're doing it. Yeah, I'll also quickly say I didn't add a point for this, but in terms of today's presenters, we have a lot of folks working on prioritization models and ways of thinking about where to put effort first. What we recognized early on in our project as well is that there were a lot of folks working on this, and we saw an opportunity to kind of tap into those and see how those were going. Rather than build our own more technical model, we've been working from a more relational place to get us started, as well as kind of considering a lot of knowledge that both Patrick, Lily, and Mike Pearson bring, and through engagements with the First Nations and other stakeholders to think about which sites that we've picked. So that's how we ended up with R25. I could go into more detail on that, but I won't today. And with that, I think what I'll do is get us started. So our first presenter today is Nick Lapointe. Well, I'll give a quick rundown of who we're talking with today. Nick Lapointe at the Canadian Wildlife Federation, Dionne Bunsha of Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance. Kevin Lucey is a late addition. I just asked him on Monday to join, and he gladly said yes. He's out in New Hampshire. Riley Finn of UBC and Raincoast, and of course Tribal Chief Tyrone McNeil, who we heard a welcome from earlier. So with that, I will ask Nick to start getting his presentation ready, and while he's doing that, so Nick, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and get your presentation on, and I will give you a quick introduction.
How's that?
Hey, Nick. Yeah, so Nick Lapointe is the Canadian Wildlife Federation's senior freshwater conservation biologist. He oversees the Federation's freshwater program, which includes research, advocacy, and conservation project implementation. Nick's expertise focuses on aquatic habitat, invasive species, and restoration ecology. So, over to you, Nick, for your ready.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to really do my best to respect the 10-minute limit there. I try to behave properly as a presenter. And that means that I'm going to cover things fairly quickly. I'll give a brief introduction to CWF, and it'll be quick because I'm talking about two major projects, essentially, one national and one BC focused. And so really can give you an idea of what we're up to, and then I'm happy to chat or share further with any of you if you have more detailed questions in this webinar or at a later date. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're not a federal agency. We're a not-for-profit organization, one of Canada's biggest environmental organizations with over 200,000 supporters and a reach of over 3 million Canadians. And we seem to be continually increasing in the number of staff that we have. For those who are familiar with the provincial angling and hunting organizations like the BC Wildlife Federation, they are affiliates of ours, but they tend to focus on fishing and hunting. We tend to focus more on habitat issues and species at risk at a national scale. So we have a big outreach and education branch that focuses on instilling a conservation ethic in Canadians and engaging Canadians in conservation. We also do research, typically in partnership with universities. We carry out conservation projects like fish passage remediation, and we also play an advocacy role with respect to mostly federal laws and policies, though occasionally provincially as well.
Nick, I just wanted to ask quickly, you don't have a screen share yet going?
Oh, it's not, it is highlighted on my screen as though it's sharing.
Oh.
That is interesting. We did this a week ago to make sure this would work.
Yeah, no worries. Take your time.
Yeah, that's not very helpful in terms of following along.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, you should have the share screen button at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, and it was green, and unless that was just...
There we go. It looks like it's begun.
Okay. I think I don't know, that's really strange. Oh well, no my fault.
Not a problem.
So.
Perfect.
Seeing that. Excellent. All right, well, that's good timing then, because that's enough about us and more about the fish passage projects. So the first project I want to talk about is our effort to develop a national barrier database. And this is something that was inspired by seeing efforts that have happened in other regions, particularly TNC, the Nature Conservancy in the northeastern US, having started on this more than 10 years ago and really developed some innovative ways of mapping and prioritizing barriers. And there are good examples as well. The Nature Conservancy of Canada on the East Coast and the Great Lakes Fisheries Commissions have each developed regional maps. And actually, most regions that we talk to, someone has developed some form of barrier database, but this isn't yet integrated nationally. And doesn't necessarily integrate barrier types either, which is a real challenge. You know, there's a database of large dams and there are road stream crossing networks, but rarely are those two integrated. And really, if you're working in freshwater connectivity, you need information on all barrier types. So with some funding from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, freshwater habitat research partnership program that they have, we spent the past year essentially scoping out this database and planning to develop it. And a lot of that involved engaging with folks across the country, working in different sectors to find out what data they had and what they would use a database for, so that we could build a database not just for CWF to prioritize barriers for remediation, but for the many other applications. You know, certainly academic researchers are interested in connectivity metrics. Provincial managers and industry are interested in infrastructure inventories. Barrier prioritization from a conservation perspective is a great thing. And, you know, DFO or other regulators or managers are interested in being able to assess the status of freshwater habitats across Canada. So what we're trying to do is design the database in a way that will serve all these purposes without, you know, trying to promise everything to everyone and give it every possible bell and whistle that it could have. Ultimately, a database like this needs to be based on a clear and connected stream network. And so we're using the National Hydrography Network, which continues to be cleaned and improved. And where we're making changes with that, we're working with NRCan to make sure that any updates we make are according to their protocols and are brought back in, so that we're not just creating a duplicate cleaned hydrography network. And then we're looking at, you know, mapping on barriers and snapping them to that hydrography data for water control structures, crossings, whether that's rail or road, dams, low-head barriers, you know, you name it. As well, we've been working with Steve Cook's lab. A master's student about 10 years ago, Charles Hatchery, had put together Can Fish Pass, which was a national database of fishways. And that hadn't been updated since about 2012. So we've started working to update that. Essentially, there's about 350 to 400 fishways that are documented in that, but they only make it into that database if someone reports them to us, or if we can find information on them through Google or any other resources or inventories like that. So if you work with a fishway, you know of one, and it's not in Can Fish Pass, let us know, and we're going to take on keeping that resource updated. Ultimately, we want to build a user interface. This is not ours, and as we've given this talk, we've sometimes had people get the impression that the National Barrier Database is up and running, and it's not yet. So this is a map from TNC's work, and just gives any user an ability to go on and view those barriers and navigate, and ideally down the road be able to apply prioritization tools or filters to search for barriers that they wish to manage in various ways. So to date, we've interviewed those stakeholders. We've formed a working group to provide advice on what end users need, and a technical advisory committee to help us figure out how to achieve what end users need. And we've created a basic data model for those large barriers and how they would interact with the hydrography network and what attributes we would have for large barriers. So our plan, that was in 2019, our plan for 2020 is to start populating that database, focusing on large barriers, but also trying to pick one or two pilot regions where we would populate that region or province with multiple different barrier types and start to do QA/QC on those data. As we do this, we want to establish data sharing relationships with partners who have some of this data to begin with, so that, again, we don't just keep duplicating efforts, or, if one of us does QA/QC, we want to be able to send those changes to our partners. And I would say by the end of this year, we would like to design our web mapping interface, but I'm not sure that it would be established by the end of this year. And the other big project that we wanted to talk about is our work in BC, which we've called our BC Fish Passage Restoration Initiative. I say we, but we've been working on this in partnership with the province's Fish Passage Technical Working Group, with PSF, Pacific Streamkeepers Federation, DFO, and Takla First Nations been working with us as well. And this was a group that essentially formed a partnership to apply for both BC SRIF and Canada Nature Fund funding, which we received as well. And this is done through CWF. We're managing those grants in this program, but we work with those other organizations through a management committee on the big picture direction of the program. And our objectives was, most of the funding that we receive is focused on actually undertaking barrier remediation projects for a variety of different barrier types. But another goal was to establish broader partnerships. And so I list those primary partners, but there are a number of other First Nations and local or regional stewardship groups that we're working with on individual barrier projects. And really what we're trying to do through that is share expertise, share ways of working to undertake these barrier remediation projects, everything from the barrier identification and planning stages through to construction and monitoring. We're also working to adapt and expand the existing prioritization tools developed by the province, and I'll speak about that in a moment. And to assess the effectiveness of fish passage remediation, which we're doing through a partnership with Scott Hinch's lab at UBC and graduate student Zach Shirker, who may be on this call. And I won't speak further about their project today. I'll leave that for Zach to share at a later date. But those are sort of the four big components of our initiative. And so to date, in the first year, we started halfway through the year and managed to remediate a couple of barriers. This year, we're on track to, I would say on track to remediate 9 barriers, though a couple of those are currently postponed because of COVID and may be delayed until next year. And we've been focusing our efforts on developing these planning and prioritization tools. So what we did was hosted a workshop in November and decided to take a target watershed approach through that. We have then spent the past 6 months or so identifying 4 target watersheds by mapping out or estimating the degree of fragmentation in all of the watershed groups in the province that contain salmon or fish species at risk. And what we're now working on is developing watershed connectivity remediation plans for each of these watersheds, where essentially what we'd like to do is more specifically map out the degree of fragmentation in those watersheds and set a goal, sort of an achievable goal over the next 10 years. If 60% of the habitat is currently accessible, we might set the goal of bringing that to 80% by 2030 and map out what it would take to accomplish that in terms of which barriers and how much that would cost. But ultimately, we're doing these 4 target watersheds as a bit of a demonstration to develop tools and demonstrate a planning process that could then be replicated in any other watershed in the province. And that is my 30,000-foot overview of some of the work that we're doing.
Oh, thanks, Nick. That was perfect. You really distilled a lot of information into 10 minutes, so thanks so much for that, especially for the Canada-wide approach. Yeah, thanks for taking the time today. Nick is going to hop in his car and stay with us.
You got it.
But I'll be handing it over now to Dionne Bunsha. So, Dionne, if you could find you here. I hope that I've got you on the list and made you a co-host so you can share your screen. No, I don't. Okay, let's do that fast. Okay, Dionne, you are now a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen. And get yourself ready.
Dan, hi Dan, I'm not sure I can share my screen.
Try it now. There we go. Now we're seeing you.
Yeah, but it doesn't give me the option somehow.
Okay, it should be at the bottom
At the bottom. Okay, yeah. Okay.
in the green button.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, I had the
No worries.
computer switchovers.
No
Okay, so I'll
worries.
just say quickly while Dionne's getting ready. So Dionne Bunsha coordinates the Aboriginal Knowledge and Climate Adapt projects for the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance. Before immigrating to Canada, Dionne was an environmental and human rights journalist in India, and she enjoys paddleboarding, trail running, and hiking, and feels grateful to live close to the outdoors. Thanks for being with us today, Dionne.
Thanks, Dan. I just wanted to make sure you can see the full screen.
Yeah, you're up.
Okay, good. So thank you for inviting me to this workshop. I've been joining the ones before as well. And it's a great way to kind of get together during these times and really learn from each other. So I'm really grateful that you've been organizing these workshops. I'm going to be speaking about the Climate Adapt project that the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance has been undertaking. So just to give you an idea of who we are, the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance is an alliance of 30 First Nations in the Lower Fraser, right from Yale to Twasin. There are about 30 nations, and we kind of we're an organization that is a voice for our member nations, and we bring all the nations together to kind of articulate our concerns, and we work collaboratively with governments as well to manage our fishery and support our cultural traditions for future generations. A little about the Climate Adapt project. The aim is to create a First Nations-led adaptation plan to deal with the impacts of climate change on fish and fish habitat. As you all know, particularly in the Lower Fraser, there are significant impacts to the watershed due to climate change. Things like water temperature, flow are already being affected due to climate change. There's a higher risk of flooding and landslides, and forest fires also further up the river also affect salmon survival. On top of that, there are already other cumulative impacts in the Lower Fraser due to human development. As we all know, it's one of the most heavily urbanized areas in Canada. So this project focuses basically on identifying priority areas where resilience planning is needed and will bring the most positive impacts. So we started this project in 2017, and this just outlines the various stages of the project. In the beginning, we just started with asking our members to identify important data that needs to be collected. So important data related to environmental values as well as threats. And then we mapped out these values and threats. And once we had this information, we met with a lot of nations to kind of get inputs on what their priority areas might be. And in the last stage, which is this year and the coming year, we're going to be doing a prioritization process with our various First Nations in the various watersheds to identify priority areas to focus on. And that's just a photograph of some of the meetings we've had, and also a screenshot of the website where all the maps are now. People can view them. It's public access. This is just a listing of the values and threats that were mapped during the project. So we mapped salmon productivity, salmon conservation units, riparian buffers, because they're important to keep the streams cool and water temperature as low as possible, and salmon rearing and holding areas. As far as the threats go, we mapped threats. There are many threats that salmon face, including things like the huge blob in the ocean, but we try to focus on things that are within our control. So things like flood risk, landslide risk, barriers to salmon passage, and contaminated sites. So with flooding, there's greater threat that, contaminants can be washed away and spread to different areas as well. So we focused on things that we anticipated impacts that could be heightened due to climate change. For the prioritization process, we are doing it in collaboration with another project that LFFA is undertaking, which is a coastal restoration project, which we're doing in partnership with the Pacific Salmon Foundation. And since, some of the mitigation measures suggested during the Climate Adapt project may also include restoration, we decided to work together on this. And we have SR Technologies as a consultant who will be, helping us and leading the process of prioritization, since they've done similar projects like this in different places in BC, and have experience with Pacific salmon. For this process, we've kind of divided the Lower Fraser area into 4 watersheds. And we'll be kind of having different watershed working groups where our First Nations leaders will provide us guidance on what they think are the, important issues to consider, important locations. And so it's a totally First Nations driven process. These are the steps in the prioritization process that we've come up with. In the first stage, we'll be clarifying the scope and scale of the plan. The second stage, developing a framework to prioritize different, strategies that may be used. In the third, once we've identified, applying this framework to identify the strategies that we do adopt. In the first stage of clarifying the scope and scale of the plan, we'll be and as I said before, at each stage is going to be guided by our member nation leaders. So, at every stage, we'll be holding meetings with our leadership to gain direction from them on, each aspect, each step of the plan, and how we should be going about it. So in the first stage of clarifying the scope, we'll be getting information from our leaders about the management objectives and the scope and the scale of the adaptation strategies, as well as the units for assessment of different strategies. So, depending on the threat and the various strategies that may be adopted, we may need to look at different scales. The scale of the strategy may depend on the species of salmon or the threat being considered. The second stage, we will look at developing a framework for prioritizing various strategies, and we're using an indicator-based approach to kind of understand vulnerability and also prioritize adaptation opportunities. So this framework is based on an IPCC framework to characterize vulnerability, and it looks at the current sensitivity of the salmon to disturbance, the exposure that Pacific salmon may face in the future due to climate impacts, and the adaptive capacity of salmon and LFFA communities to respond to climate change. It's also going to be based on looking at the various impacts at different stages of the salmon life cycle to identify bottlenecks at different stages of the salmon life cycle. So this is just a diagram that helps explain it better. So as you can see, in black are the various stages of the salmon life cycle, and the dark gray boxes are basically the various kind of indicators that would kind of tell you give you an idea of the health and the conditions needed for the salmon at different points. And the light gray boxes are various adaptation measures that could be used and the possible impacts on those various indicators. In the third stage, like I said, we would be kind of identifying any data gaps that may exist and trying to, for example, we do know that water temperature and water flow are very important indicators for salmon survival. And so trying to see if we can incorporate that in some way, as well as human impacts like forest harvesting and things like that, as well as past use of the watershed by LFFA nations, which again our members will inform us and guide those discussions. And in the last stage, we will be using all the indicators that our member nations finalize and prioritize to filter, to kind of, as a filter to kind of prioritize which actions would be the most important. So as you can see in this diagram, based on locations or streams that meet certain indicator priorities, we'd be able to narrow down the areas to focus on. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. And I just wanted to acknowledge funding from CERNAC that has helped to make this project possible, as well as all the support we've got from technical people such as Zoetica Environmental Consulting that did a lot of the mapping, Culture Code that did our website, and ESSA Technologies that will be leading our prioritization work. Thank you.
So much, Dionne. Thanks for your presentation today.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand it over to Kevin Lucey, who is a late addition, as I mentioned earlier. I saw his presentation on a webinar with the EPA, who prepared a similar webinar, so I will provide a link shortly. But so Kevin Lucey is the Habitat Coordinator for the Coastal Program at the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. He has a background in stream habitat surveys, culvert assessments, and salt marsh monitoring. And since 2009, his work is focused on dam removal and other coastal habitat restoration projects. So thanks for joining us, Kevin.
It's great to be here, Dan. Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
We can indeed.
Okay, great. So thank you for that introduction. It's really, it is great to be here to share our work. We made this assessment protocol with the idea of transferability because we recognize this as a global issue for sure. So I wanted to just give you a quick summary of the project, and we've been working with the Nature Conservancy since 2014, and we recognized we had mutual interests in better understanding our road stream crossings through estuarine environments. And so depicted here on the title screen is a map of New Hampshire's coastal zone, and this is our 17 coastal zone communities, and also depicted as our extent of salt marsh, as well as our tidal crossings. So tidal crossings are defined as under this project as culverts or bridges that convey bidirectional tidal flow. And we also included those that are going to become subject to tidal flow with 1.7 foot of sea level rise. And so just to orient you quickly to our environment, we have two large estuaries of national significance, including Great Bay. Up here, Great Bay has 7 river systems that drain a 1,000 square mile watershed. We also have the Hampton-Seabrook estuary, which is a 50-mile watershed. And then we also have a lot of smaller estuarine systems. So here's just a close-up of Great Bay. You can see that it's mudflat dominated, eelgrass, oysters, and we also have a variety of diadromous fish that still persist despite each of these rivers being dammed during the Industrial Revolution, if not before. And the Hampton-Seabrook estuary is dominated by high salt marsh. It's really quite beautiful, 4,000 acres approximately of high marsh, Spartina dominated salt marsh. Here's just a quick drone image of the Hampton Seabrook Estuary, and you can see significant low-lying development. And this is one of our key tourist areas called Hampton Beach, and this area would be flooded, well, not flooded, flooded with tourists on a normal summer day. Here's a quick output of a recent vulnerability assessment of our roads, which is that quite a number of our roads are flooded currently and will be subject to more flooding in the future. So we've been focusing on tidal culverts for over 30 years of the coastal program, largely focusing on restoration. And we've implemented a lot of restoration, restoring tidal hydrology to approximately 10% of our total salt marsh. But as the years have gone by, people have started asking a little bit more nuanced questions about how we should be managing these systems for ecosystem health, for sea level rise, for flood hazard mitigation, operations and maintenance, and other things, which led us to the Nature Conservancy and the Department of Environmental Services kind of recognizing the need to better understand our inventory. And so we developed a local committee comprised of our Department of Transportation at the state, as well as our Fish and Game Department, to develop a locally specific assessment protocol for tidal culverts and bridges. We then brought that to a larger audience throughout New England, and in fact, with our Canadian partners, with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and we had a workshop in 2015 to kind of further vet our draft protocol. And we did that coordination through the Gulf of Maine Council, which is an organization that's been around through since the 80s, in which the provinces and the states and the federal governments can coordinate on natural resource management issues in the Gulf of Maine. So here's the framework of the protocol that we developed. You know, there's a lot of different information, and we found it was really productive to put this information in different bins. And management objectives here, depicted here, are basically, why are we doing this? Why are we going out into the field to assess culverts? A road manager has a certain perspective, a salt marsh scientist has a certain perspectives, and we wanted to try to get as much out of this protocol as possible. So that's the framework. We developed a protocol that answered these management objectives. Is the crossing in good condition? Does it create a tidal restriction? Can it pass fish? What about salt marsh migration under sea level rise? How about what's the vegetation look upstream and downstream of the crossing? Is it a flood risk? And what's the feasibility of doing something about this? i.e., are there a lot of upstream property owners, houses, etc.? This is a list of our field protocols, as well as GIS analyses that we incorporated into the protocol. And then we developed a list of 15 different scores that is applied to each of the assessed crossings. So just to give an example here, to look at structure condition, we wanted to know the condition of the crossing. So that's structure condition. For the assessment, we went out into the field, we looked at the head walls, the wing walls, the overall condition, the road, and we also assessed scour. And we developed basically a criteria system in which, for example, 3 poor ratings were given a high replacement priority. So we've done this across multiple assessment parameters to develop criteria for 15 different scores. And we developed initially a paper assessment protocol with a pretty lengthy and detailed methodology, but which we implemented in 2018. And when we implemented that, we developed a digital application through ArcGIS Online, in which we used iPads. And we were fortunate enough to leverage an existing system called the Statewide Asset Database Exchange in New Hampshire. And this database is, again, an ArcGIS Online platform in which we store road condition information, culvert information, sidewalks, guardrails, etc. So we really were set up with an existing system, and that really kind of launched us into something pretty modern and more effective. So our scoring system was from 1 to 5 and was based on replacement priority. So here you can see just the different management objectives that we had. So a score of 1, things are good. No need to replace it. A score of 5, things are either bad or there's a high priority. So for instance, there's a high salt marsh migration potential for a site. So that site would be flagged as a high priority. And anything above a 3 is generally a cause for concern. The basis of the field protocol was an elevation survey, a relative elevation survey, in which we performed a longitudinal profile of the channel, and then we conducted an elevation survey of the crossing structure itself. In the longitudinal profile, we captured elevation of the channel and distance from, we basically started 2 hydraulic controls upstream of the crossing and went 2 hydraulic controls downstream of the crossing and captured the height of the channel and any substrate or other features that were worth recording. And then we looked at the crossing cross section, in which we got the invert of the structure, the ceiling of the structure, and we also got certain water indicators, which are quite complex. So we looked at low tide water surface elevation, and you'll see in the image here HWI rack and HWI stain. So that stands for high water rack and high water stain. The high water stain is indicative of the mean tide, and the high water rack is representative of the mean higher high water. And we also captured information on the road surface elevation. So we're able to put that together for each of the 118 culverts that were assessed, culverts and bridges, to build these elevation surveys. So here you can see this is the channel, this is the upstream, and this structure here is the crossing, profile of the crossing, and we have the high water indicators. And many of our evaluation criteria or scores are developed from this data. So I wanted to give you a quick, get right into the data, I guess, into the results. So each of those 15 scores had fairly complex criteria associated with them. So this is for structure condition. We found, based on stakeholder engagement, that structure condition is the ultimate reason why a replacement happens. And so we wanted to make sure that we were answering that question for road managers, for departments of transportation and others. And so here you can see, this is, again, I already gave an example similar to this, but a fairly complex scoring criteria that was then translated into an algorithm and would generate results such as this, which is a bar graph showing that 33 of our structures in New Hampshire are in poor condition, or have received a score of 5 and have multiple indicators of poor condition. Interestingly, many of these are located on an abandoned railroad through the Hampton Sea Estuary. And also, interestingly, many of the green circles, which represent scores of 1, are sites that were previously restored within the past 20 years or so. Inundation risk to roadway. So I told you about the high water indicator rack. So that's representative of the mean higher high water. And we compared that to the road surface elevation, developed some criteria, and generated these scores. So by and large, our inland tidal crossings are not subject to tidal inundation, whereas those located on the Atlantic coast are. We looked at tidal restriction in a variety of ways. We compared channel widths upstream and downstream. We looked for scour pools, and we compared those upstream and downstream compared to the average channel width. But probably the most instructive was evaluating the difference in tidal range upstream and downstream of the crossing. And then from those 3 component scores, we rolled them up into an overall tidal restriction score. So we have one example of the tidal range ratio. And in this metric, you can see a score of 5 is we had to create specific scenarios, such as the downstream invert is perched above high tide. So that effectively would be a dam. And you can see all the bracketing of results that we did for subsequent scores lower than 5. And here are some quick results. We have a mixed bag. Also in this, because we're dealing with such a wide variety of habitats, we had to create and structures that are not yet subject to sea level rise. We had to create specific scenarios like limited tidal crossing sites that had to be scored on separate criteria. And this again is the overall tidal restriction score. This is kind of a a manufactured score, which we did to pull out all of those 5. So we wanted to know what were the worst ones so that we could best invest our resources. We also looked at salt marsh migration. That's a big issue here in the Northeast. We expect to lose, frankly, most, if the worst case sea level rise scenarios come to fruition, models show that we stand to lose thousands of acres of salt marsh. And so we're looking at how do we prepare those lands that are going to be subject to inundation in the future so that they can be salt marsh. And so we're looking at those sites, and clearly here we looked at a 1.7 foot sea level rise scenario. Had we picked a larger scenario such as 6 feet, I think all of our sites would be red at that point. And here's just an example of what 1.7 foot of sea level rise looks on a site in New Hampshire. You know, quite a bit of extent of the area represented in magenta is the amount that we stand to gain through an adequately sized culvert. Again, I think I'm at my time, and this is just a summary of the 15 scores. We've got these component scores based on infrastructure and ecological, but then we developed these combined overall scores that looked at infrastructure, ecological, and combined. And that was really meant to really hone in on the biggest needs. And just to give you a sense of the complexity of that prioritization process, here's the algorithm that we use to develop, just as an example. And then lastly, on data sharing, we have all of our reports posted at these websites. The whole data set is available for download through ArcGIS Online. And this is one of the data products we produced for each of the tidal crossings that were assessed to give kind of communities and road managers an at-a-glance look at our results. So I think that's all I had, Dan, and hopefully I stayed within my time.
Yeah, that's great, Kevin. You were a tiny bit over, but
sorry about that.
This is a really good content, and since you've gone through the whole process and they're having results, it's great to see someone on the other end. Thanks. With that, I actually just wanted to check in with Tyrone. Tyrone, I'm going to unmute you for a second because I think you said you had to leave at 11:20. Is that right?
That's right, Dan.
Okay. Would it be okay to ask you if you would go next? Because I just don't want to put you over time. So
sure.
Would it be okay to ask?
Appreciate that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tyrone. So whenever you're ready.
Okay, so I don't have a presentation, Dan. I got a couple of screens open that I'll share in a second, but just coming at this from a slightly different approach than the previous presenters, and starting from a higher level. You know, we're talking about fish passage and flooding, but that's only a component. You can't respond effectively to that without raising broader flood management issues and strategies. Or you can't respond to it effectively without bringing a broader aspect of climate change into the conversation, as well as a broader geography. So we are working, as you called us at the onset, mainland Coast Salish. That's the 31 communities from Yale up past Hope to Semiahmoo to Squamish, and we're one component of the broader Coast Salish nation, which is southern Vancouver Island and down into the Puget Sound area. But we're trying to distinguish ourselves from others in when it comes to the broader flood management, we can't help but bring in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Canada is signatory to it. The province of BC is signatory to it. The First Nations Leadership Council, who is our senior leadership in the province, are signatory to an agreement between BC and Canada that brings in First Nations. So I really key in on the action plan aspect of Sendai. And in that, the the action plan, it's following the four main principles and priorities of Sendai. And they're there on the screen, but I'm going to concentrate on priority 3 and priority 4 then, because we're talking about resilience here. We want friendly fish passage, when we want to ensure that when fish are behind floodgates or pumps or whatever, that the water quality they're in is good for them, that there's deep enough channels that the water doesn't get too warm for them, just basic life supporting aspects for salmon at all stages. Knowing that there's multiple jurisdictions at play here, when I say there's 31 mainland Coast Salish communities from Yale down, I think there's about 30 what you call local governments in that same geography too. And then we have the province and various ministries within the province, like EMBC and environment in particular, and there's roles for the federal government as well. So we're trying to find a way to bring everybody together, appreciating that the province tasked Fraser Basin Council to do some work around the Lower Fraser flood management strategy. Certainly the First Nations don't feel satisfied in our participation there. So it's why we created the Emergency Planning Secretariat that brings all of our communities together. So we have a conversation, like what is important to us? What lens do we put on flood mitigation, flood planning? And whether you bring in these two priorities of Sendai or the Hyogo framework on action, calling for action, they're for the most part they're based on human values, which are important, and they're our values too. But we're also interested in other values that are beyond human, and particularly salmon for us. And we have stories, Dave, that back in the day, our folks could communicate with what we call the salmon people. That pre-contact, our consumption of salmon with the appropriate protocols constituted about 90% of the protein in their diet. And if you're thinking around contact and pre-contact, when you run those numbers, you're looking at about 1,000 pounds per capita per annum. So every man, woman, and child, 1,000 pounds of salmon. And we did that by having large runs of all species of salmon, not only going through the Fraser, but also into the tributaries here in the Lower Fraser, whether they be creeks, rivers, sloughs, waterways, and whatnot. And the development has had a serious impact on that. So we're trying to work with this strategy in such a way that we're imparting our lens into it, appreciating that in all likelihood, all 39 folks on this call appreciate values around fish and salmon habitat and whatnot. There's a little bit of rubs when it comes to local governments and zoning and planning, those kind of things, with policies, both provincial and federal. So it's about creating space, and we've got the ability to create that space because whether we express our rights through Section 35(1) of the Constitution or Supreme Court decisions like Chilcotin, or this new piece of provincial legislation called the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And it's Article 19 in particular there that says that we as First Nations have a right to be involved in decision-making that affects our lands and resources. So a part of this needs to come to an understanding between us and local governments in particular around those kinds of conversations. We should have the ability to look at an OCP and agree or disagree with it and enter into conversations. Because too many plans out there don't prioritize or don't give high enough value to things like salmon habitat. So any friendlies out there, we'll gladly work with. Those that don't have the concerns that we do, there's going to be rubs there. But we don't want to be confrontational. We don't want to be combative. We're just sharing our views, our values. And by the way, we've got this provincial legislation behind us. We've got Section 35 behind us, Sendai behind us, and those kind of things. So it's about establishing effective relations, and empowering us and giving space for us to have these very kinds of conversations. Because looking at the group of participants here, there's folks that I wouldn't normally engage on a regular basis, whereas in other sectors, I engage people provincially and nationally. So in that conversation, we want to put on the table our values around salmon habitat, salmon protection of all life, the entire life cycle. Knowing that there's urban development has directly impacted them, but there's opportunities to rectify that or in fact reconcile that. One of the things we're messaging out, even in this COVID environment, when the federal government and for that matter the provincial government are trying to restart the economy, well, let's spend some of those dollars on salmon habitat reclamation and whatnot, because it's important to us. I think it's important to British Columbians. And to date, we've been using our legal rights to advance our prioritization of fish, but it's not getting anywhere with the federal government. We have something called Sparrow, which is a Supreme Court decision, but the department responsible for it basically tells the Supreme Court to administer their ruling because the Department of Fisheries Oceans isn't. And given DFO has a mandate for virtually all things salmon, I think it's incumbent on First Nations and local governments and like-minded people of all stripes to come together to hold a regulator like DFO to account, to ensure that habitat is protected. In order to protect it, it needs monitoring. There's too much of a reliance by both federal and provincial governments for folks to self-police themselves. And we see that as being inadequate. So that the monitoring / enforcement needs to be an important component going forward. But just elevating it again a little bit, when we're talking about the safe passage for salmon in flood infrastructure here in the Lower Fraser, well, we can't help but to have a Fraser watershed-wide discussion. There's I maintain that the poor forest practices in the province over the last 20 years in particular are allowing logging companies to self-police themselves. They're logging right through creeks and rivers, whether they be fish-bearing or not. And what that's doing is it prevents the land from holding water. So what would typically be held by forests and large tracts of trees and understories and whatnot, it's not there anymore. So when it rains in the watershed, it hits those creeks and rivers, it hits the Fraser, and now we have more volume of water coming down, bringing about a million cubic meters of gravel into the Lower Fraser. So when we're talking about flood infrastructure, you have to put gravel as a response to it, because the dikes right now are becoming inadequate because the gravel buildup is so much. So now that's having more impact on your flood mitigation strategies, like pumps and gates and whatnot, because if the bed of the river is raising, then some of the infrastructure is becoming inadequate or outdated, which brings in priority 4 of Sendai. So how do we build back better? So what we would maintain, building back better, isn't necessarily just to do with human values. It's values such as salmon and whatnot too. I'm not sure if I switched screens here. I'm not sure if I did it automatically or do I have to shut off this one and restart it?
I think if you hit the share screen button at the bottom, then it will let you pick a new one.
Okay. Because I just want to bring in this one here, which puts a lot of things in. Starting on the right over here, really we're talking about flood. There's other pressures here that I've got links that take me off into other mind maps. But just carrying it down here around Sendai, so we're trying to put some visuals together where folks start understanding the value and worth of something like Sendai. And this is their own language here. So if you can imagine us taking each one of these, which is a fully incorporated in the Sendai, and ask every step of the way, what about fish? What about fish habitat? What about water? What about water quality? What about monitoring enforcement? All that. And we have an opportunity to build that out here in this flood strategy. Really hopeful that we've got some local governments that align with us, that support the value and worth of protecting and enhancing salmon habitat within what they would call their jurisdictions, their municipalities, their cities, because we want to look at this in a sustainable fashion. We're thinking, 50, 100 years in the future, not just the here and now. And some of this is going to affect land value, but there's no help but putting land value on the table. If an area in 50 years or 100 years is going to be 3 and 4 meters underwater, you can't protect that. So let's acknowledge that in the plan, that at some point we have to kind of walk away from these lands because just economically it's not worth protecting. But being mindful that when we're talking about the economics of it, we're including our values of economics. Well, what cost is it going to be to lose fish habitat? What cost is it going to be to create harm to fish runs? You know, those kind of things. So we need to be there at every step of the way to ensure those principles and values are maintained, that they're calculated, that they're included in the plan going forward. So appreciating the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this with the group here. Thanks, everyone. And perfect timing. I literally have to leave in like 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's so great. Yeah, thank you so much, Tyrone. Thanks for sharing all this and really helping to widen the perspective on why we're doing prioritization in the first place and how we should think about it. I also realized, and I apologize for this, I didn't read out your introduction, but yeah, Tyrone does have to leave us in a couple of minutes. Partly my fault for sending out that email yesterday or last week that changed the end timing to 11:30, but with the addition of Kevin, I thought we could probably go till noon. So I understand if others of you have to leave, but I would like to, I also forgot to read out Tyrone's bio. And so it explains that he is also a very busy man. So we're very lucky to have him join us today. So I'm just gonna end here by reading out some of the other things that Tyrone is involved with. He is a tribal chief of Stolo Tribal Council, a member of Seabird Island Band. He has extensive experience working to advance First Nations languages and education, collaborating with First Nations across the country and developing agreements and partnerships with government. He holds numerous leadership positions, including Vice President and Tribal Chief of Stolo Tribal Council, President of First Nation Education Steering Committee, AFN Chiefs Committee on Education Rep for BC, Chair of the Emergency Planning Secretariat, Chair of Seabird College, President of the SKUCL. Am I saying that right, Tyrone?
SKUCL. That's the proper name to say Seabird.
Okay, SKUCL or Seabird, yep. Development Corporation and Standing Chair of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. So thank you so much for being with us today, Tyrone, and very understandable that you have other places to be.
Thanks, Dan, and let's stay in touch on this. You guys are doing good work, and I'll find a way to work with you and probably some of the other folks on the participants list as well.
Yes, let's please do. Yeah, yeah.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you very much.
See you. Bye, everyone.
With that, I will hand it over to Riley Finn. Riley is a master's student in Dr. Tara Martin's Conservation Decisions Lab at UBC. His research focuses on understanding the historical habitat for salmonids in the Lower Fraser River and how optimization can be used to guide the restoration of habitat connectivity. Before starting his master's work, he worked with Raincoast Conservation Foundation on their Lower Fraser Salmon program. Thanks, Riley.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Can you hear me and see my screen and everything?
Yeah, we can indeed.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking today about kind of the second half of my master's project, which is looking at a tool for prioritizing the restoration of habitat connectivity for salmonids in the Lower Fraser. And I think the context around the Lower Fraser has been covered a little bit, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it has some of Canada's most valuable agricultural land, third largest metro population and largest port. And so a lot of this development, along with flood infrastructure to protect it all, alienates a lot of fish habitat. So these are some of the main culprits, just to kind of give a visual. So we have a culvert on the right there, and then floodgates up in the top left, which kind of line a lot of the main stem and some of the larger tributaries. And then there's a couple of large hydro dams that alienate some fish habitat in the Lower Fraser as well. And a lot of these barriers have been mapped. So a few key data sets have been brought together. So Watershed Watch Salmon Society has done some great work, mapping out where all of those pieces of flood infrastructure are. The Fish Information Summary System was a data set that was maintained by the province for a long time, and it kind of mapped out observed flood fish obstructions. So not necessarily assessed barriers, but they were observed to potentially be obstructions. And then we have the current provincial stream crossing inventory system, which is kind of the systematic way province is going about assessing these. And so the first aspect of my master's was looking at, like, where are we? So trying to map out, lost streams, what's been channelized, and what's upstream of these mapped barriers. And so this is one of the key maps that came out of that. So, based on current data of mapped barriers, about 41% of the linear stream habitat is not accessible. And this actually varies greatly by the conservation unit of CU that you look at. So for example, the Boundary Bay, Chinook, and Coho are quite a bit worse off than, say, the Fraser Chinook, the Fraser Canyon Chinook. And so if that's kind of where we are, the project aim for this is try to identify which barriers to restore in priority to, maximize the access to salmon habitat, in full recognition that resources for this kind of work are limited. So we kind of have to make the most of it. And so the approach that we're looking at using is the systematic conservation planning approach, which generally involves 4 main steps, which is looking at collecting data on biodiversity features, listing the management options, setting constraints, so say like a budget, and then maximizing outcomes kind of around those constraints. So this approach is commonly used in protected area network design. So management alternatives could be different parcels of land to protect. Each parcel of land might have different species, amounts of habitat, and quality of habitat. Then the optimization can be used to find the best land parcels that would best protect the most habitat. So this same thing can be done instead of a land parcel for a protected area. We can evaluate different potential barriers to be removed. And so I'll get into the kind of the steps of where we're at with this work. So the first aspect is kind of identifying the costs, and these vary kind of mainly across the different types of barriers that we have in the Lower Fraser. So culverts, flood infrastructure, and hydro dams all vary from each other quite a bit, then also within those categories quite a bit. So we've been collecting through literature review and expert elicitation, trying to get estimates for kind of broad generalizations for what these different pieces of infrastructure might cost to remove. And so that cost can be explicitly kind of assigned to each different location. And this is in conjunction with the amount of habitat and the quality of that habitat and the species that would be of benefit. So we have a couple of hydro dams that might cost orders of magnitude more than a culvert, but they might also have orders of magnitude more habitat upstream. So does the relatively high cost of restoring passage past the dam pay off with the amount of potential habitat when compared against every other option? And to characterize habitat quantities, we've been using BC Freshwater Atlas to measure kind of upstream up to the next barrier how much habitat would become available. And then we're also using indicators for habitat quality, so looking at proportion of the upstream watershed that's undisturbed, or the proportion of the riparian habitat that exists. Also, water use channelization and upstream can be measured and prioritized for against. And then also using the CU boundary maps for species presence. And then it gets even more complicated when we consider that we're working with an anadromous species. So we for this requirement, we have to work from the base of the watershed up. And this is kind of the strength of what the optimization approach provides, because we can consider these and how they're spatially connected. So how does considering potential sites individually compare against considering sites that are maybe complementary? So where are those kind of opportunities? So for example, flood infrastructure in the Lower Fraser might be comparatively more expensive when compared with culverts, but they often sit at the base of these systems. So how does the consideration of complementarity, along with the habitat amount and the quality of the habitat, influence where we might carry out restoration? So it's kind of taking into account the restorability of upstream projects while we're looking at the individual aspects of each project. And then all of these kind of aspects that can be mathematically put into a model, the costs, the habitat quality, the quantity, and what species are there, these are aspects of the world that we can try and measure, but it kind of gets thrown into a blender when we consider the importance. So Tyrone brought this up, the different groups have different values, and so how can we accommodate that, especially when we're taking such a kind of a quantitative approach? And we we can try and do this with a more mathematical approach. So I just bring this up because this is kind of how, once we've kind of quantified the cost and the potential benefits in terms of the amounts of habitat or the species that might benefit, we can add feature weights to these different quantified things. And so we can rerun this with different weights on these different features, and we can get an idea of how the priorities might change. And we can also accommodate, different organizational capacities when it comes to varying the budget to see how that might change where the priority barriers are. So by varying the budget, we can be accommodating of different organizational capacities and investigate, what might be possible at different levels of investment. So if a fund is announced and it has a certain, amount of money to go towards barrier remediation, what's possible in terms of the amount of habitat that could be restored in different scenarios. And so I'll just give a quick kind of preview of what these outputs kind of look like. So we have on the left here, it might be hard to see, but essentially we have selection frequency. So the higher the selection frequency, the higher the priority of the barrier might be. And on the left, it's a habitat length scenario. So it's only prioritizing for the barriers with the most amount of length of habitat upstream. And then once we work in a simple measure of what the habitat quality might be, so that's watershed disturbance, you can see that kind of the red points shift up into the Lillooet and the Harrison and kind of the Alouette watersheds, where those more pristine habitats might be as compared to the Lower Fraser, where there seems to be more opportunity for larger amounts of habitat, but there might be more work to be done there in terms of the actual amount of restoration. And so we're still working on kind of honing, what these quality metrics are and how we can measure them. But essentially, we're just trying to identify, what can be included, and then how do we accommodate those variations in values across organizations. And so then I just have a few key takeaways here. So the variable cost, habitat quantity, and quality, and the spatial connectedness of the barriers is what makes the optimization of limited resource zones really difficult. But this optimization approach can help us characterize, what is the cost effectiveness of these different locations. And that can be considered in conjunction with varying values. And so we could run a few different scenarios and look across these scenarios and say, which barriers are coming up across different scenarios despite different values, and maybe that's where the compromises are. However, it's based on data that is currently connected. So that's one of the weaknesses. But so the outcomes will have to be ground truth, and additional data will need to be collected to make sure, what we have in the model is what's actually, out there in the world. But as new data is collected, we can integrate that directly back into the model. So it's iterative in that sense. So if we identify a priority barrier and another barrier is identified actually downstream of it that wasn't mapped before, we can include that in and rerun it to see if it's still a priority and adapt from there. So it can guide data collection in that way, and it can also guide decision making. And it's not confined to the Lower Fraser. So a lot of the data sets that I'm using are province-wide. And so this approach can be used kind of anywhere that we can estimate the cost and the habitat values, or any kind of other quantifiable value that we'd be interested in prioritizing for. So yeah, thank you, Evan. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Riley. That was great. I think you were right on time, but I started my timer a bit late, so great work. Thanks for the update on your work. We knew we wanted to get in touch with you right away when we started our project, and I've been really interested to follow your progress. So looking forward to more.
Yeah,
for sure. With that, I will say I've put a link into the chat to go and ask your questions in Slido. And at this time, I'll invite all of our presenters to unmute themselves. And I will also just do a little screen sharesy kind of thing here, so that we can see the different, as you'll see, I have selfishly put my own question in first into the Slido, so I'll give you all a bit of time to catch up and add your questions into the Slido. But for now, what I'd like to ask our panelists And I'll let you guys kind of answer as you're going along, but reflecting back, what is the most unexpected learning as you've been going through your prioritizing process? What was something that maybe you didn't foresee?
I can start with that. So it's related to this first question, but also the question that just popped up here in terms of, the concerns of local title holders and different stakeholders. So in the beginning, what I thought was that you could just, try and quantify everything, put it into a model and come out with a decision. But that's really, after going to, Resilient Waters kind of workshops, and then also the workshops put on by the Canadian Wildlife Federation on their prioritization, there's such a broad breadth of opinions and what should be prioritized for that I kind of shifted towards, focusing on, what is the physical environment? And then from there, you can put in front of people, okay, so this, if we prioritize for this, these are where the priorities are. And you can start a discussion in that way. So it's really more of a decision support than a decision-making tool. And so in that way is how you can kind of integrate those concerns of local title holders or different stakeholders by trying to find, where is the compromise between, the environmental, which is kind of the output of the model, and then also, the different concerns of the people that live in these locations. And because that's, and like, I don't really know how you would quantify that in a fair way that everybody would agree with. And so it kind of just comes down to being decision support versus decision making.
Yeah, thanks, Riley. Dionne, Kevin, or Nick?
Yeah, I guess the thing that surprised us the most, prioritization models. Yeah, can you hear me well?
Yeah, you cut out for a second, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, just saying that there's great models out there, but ultimately, and I think this is something that the technical working group found out over the past 10 years, and Riley touched on, so much of it really depends on the field verification of barriers, especially if you've got many potential barriers and many of them may or may not be. Any model that you run, assuming them all to be barriers, the results of that are going to be completely changed when you actually go out and verify and confirm that, only half or 75% are barriers. So what it means is essentially you almost need multiple models, one model to choose which barriers to assess. And then once you have that assessment data, a second model to then, add in those cost-effective. And the reality is you might actually need multiple stages of that. And you can accomplish that either by creating different models for each stage or doing what Riley just said, which is making sure that the model you're building can be adjusted with those field results.
Great, thanks, Nick. Dionne or Kevin?
Sure, I'll weigh in. This is Kevin. One of the things that was pretty interesting is, we conducted these elevation surveys of these culverts, but in the Hampton Seabrook estuary, one of the images I put up early in my presentation, we found scour pools that were massive, and we didn't expect that. And had we probably would have developed a metric for scour pool depth as being an indicator of restrictedness. And so I guess that was really instructive of these what should be low energy systems that have been now highly pressurized with these undersized crossings and water just pushing through, scouring sediments. And so I think that was the biggest surprise of our project.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Dionne?
Yeah, I guess, for me, we're just starting the prioritization process. So more than the process, I could speak to just the meetings that we've had with all our member nations and just what their priorities are and considering how far up the river, our nations go. I thought there would be differences depending on geography of the region, but what was interesting for me to find was that a a lot of people had the same concerns, like no matter where along the river they were. So, a lot of spoke about the barriers to salmon passage at different stages along the river. And so, I think that was something that I found was interesting, that we all share a lot of common concerns.
Thanks, Dionne. I'll just go in order of the questions that have come in. Also, just to let you guys know that if you're in the Slido, you can upvote other questions if you like them, want to hear them, and I'll prioritize that way. But so the next question, and Riley and I think Nick to some extent touched on this, but do you combine the thoughts, concerns, and opinions of local title holders and stakeholders with the quantitative data that you collect, and if so, how?
So I guess as far as our project goes, we are focusing purely on our nations. So we are not, of course, we collaborate with a lot of groups like yours, Pacific Salmon Foundation. And so there is collaboration with, people who are working on similar issues. But as far as obtaining feedback, we're focusing on our First Nations leaders, and how we combine it with the quantitative data. So the quantitative data informs the decisions and inputs that we get from our First Nations leaders.
Thanks, Dionne. Any other thoughts from other speakers?
Yeah, I'll weigh in. This is Kevin. On one of our metrics is called adverse impacts, and basically that for us gets at feasibility. And what we did was just basically conduct a pretty simple GIS analysis that included, a 1% storm event, a storm surge event, and we enumerated all of the potential impacts that would occur upstream of a particular crossing. So houses, sheds, driveways, other things like that, and we came out with a number, and that's how we got at feasibility, and to get a sense of whether a project was feasible. So.
Great. Riley or Nick, you want to add anything?
Well, maybe two different perspectives from my end. One is, now that we've picked our target watersheds, and we know we want to sort of engage in those watersheds over the long term, we are really working hard to engage with local people, local First Nations, to gain knowledge of those watersheds and, gain their input in terms of where to focus efforts and what to focus on within those watersheds. So local perspectives and priorities, I think, are absolutely critical in conservation planning. The other half of that, in an almost unrelated sense, is the title of the actual barriers and who owns them and who is responsible for them, is something that we're just starting to dig into and to think about how that might affect the approach you take. Because there are some barriers where there may be an existing liability where the solution to that barrier is not to spend public funds on fixing someone else's liability, but to look at some of the enforcement tools that Tyrone had mentioned, had alluded to in his conversation. So thinking about barrier remediation as a diverse toolkit, that there are multiple ways to fix a barrier and multiple paths to achieving conservation, is something we want to do. We're not only looking at enforcement by any means, but thinking about how that factors in. And I know there are cases in Ontario where there's problems because there's a private owner of a barrier who doesn't have a liability for it and refuses to allow it to be removed or remediated. And that becomes a very challenging situation. So definitely a factor to consider, but not one that typically there is a regional scale data set on. It's almost something you have to investigate barrier by barrier.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Nick. I think we've had Riley, did you have anything to add to that? No, I think you spoke to that already, kind of in your last one, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I might just add in, looking at kind of maybe municipal priorities or different priorities of, like Nick mentioned, you know, who's responsible for, say, road culverts in a given area. You know, they might have their own priority, and just in terms of kind of restoring that or upgrading it to make sure it's up to code or anything like that. So you could take kind of an environmental prioritization approach and try to identify, you know, what are the overlaps between, you know, two completely different prioritization.
Thanks, Riley. Yeah, okay, next question is, what are some of the current gaps in prioritization frameworks and exercises?
I mean, I think there's certainly data gaps. You know, in terms of those barriers, that's a key piece of information to have. From our perspective, there's a gap in climate change modeling. It would be great within those target watersheds to say which of these habitats are valuable now and will be valuable under climate change projections in terms of changing flows and water temperatures. But we don't know of those projections, the existence of those projections, and we don't have the time to calculate or model those. So that doesn't give us much of an opportunity to incorporate that into our model. So if anyone does know of those data, if anyone is working on those models or can do that for the target watershed we're working on, we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, and I'll say to any of the participants, if you have ideas on any of the questions that are coming out, please feel free to put them in the chat, names or URLs. Yeah, any other panelists?
I can add to that. So I guess similar to the data limitation, at least in the Lower Fraser context, there's kind of a limitation on governance and communication. So you know you can have these outputs, but how do you engage all of the different actors that might be, you know, relevant to a particular decision? So you know, having that capacity to be able to engage with everybody who is interested in engaging, and you know, having those avenues open is kind of a limitation, at least in the Lower Fraser, that could really go a long way to helping these kinds of processes.
I guess I could add that having, like, especially when you're working with salmon, you kind of look at your own region, whereas, you know, we need to have an approach that looks right. I mean, beyond it, if the salmon are passing through other regions where you're really looking at that, and having that kind of life cycle approach where we're looking at all the complexities and impacts throughout the salmon life cycle in each run is kind of difficult, given the fact that we can only kind of deal with what's within our territory and our capacity. So I think there's a gap between the human view and the natural processes, for sure, that take place, and governance capacity as well. So I don't think there's any government organization that's taking a holistic view either. So, you know, we're kind of each ministry is looking at the problem within the capacity of the laws that they implement. And so there's a need to have a more holistic view, I think, as well.
Yeah. Kevin, you have anything you want to add to that?
I think along the lines, you know, we do have some technical gaps, future potential conditions. I think we have a pretty good handle on sea level rise, but future potential precipitation, we really don't. But more important than that, I think, is the whole social side of things. You know, when you're talking about tidal culverts and you're talking about putting one in now, what's our planning horizon for that? Are communities prepared to make decisions for the next 75 years with uncertain future potential conditions? And that's why we have a resilience program that is working with communities to kind of build that out and build those prioritizations systems on a town by town basis.
Yeah, that's great. Having a good handle on climate change, that's good. Yeah, let's move on to the next. So for any of the presenters, when making the models, how do you determine what is fish habitat in estuarine areas, particularly in salt marshes? Anybody able to speak to that?
I would just say my work mostly focuses on the stream, freshwater stream habitat. So I haven't done much with modeling the fish habitat for salt marshes. But I guess that might be where, a data gap exists, and in terms of, where are those habitats, where do the fish exist? And I know some of my colleagues at Raincoast are doing a lot of that work in terms of removing barriers in the Fraser estuary.
Yeah, is anybody else working on estuaries and fish habitat? It sounds like we've hit on a real data gap, potentially. So, yeah, it occurs to me, Kevin, did you have anything to say on that?
Well, I guess I'd say first that, our Atlantic salmon are now extinct here. And so we really manage on other diagenous fish such as river herring, American eel, sea lamprey. And we include all salt marsh and as potential habitat for those species.
Gotcha. So is that, if I understand correctly, like salt marshes are basically fish habitat for you guys?
Yes, that's correct.
Like all of it.
Yeah.
And how about just kind of the estuary more broadly? Like, is there, I guess maybe that is more to the core of the question, and you can type in the chat if I'm missing this, but like more broadly looking at the whole estuary, where do you determine what is fish habitat versus what isn't?
I'm not sure I can speak to that any further.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. Let's leave that one there. That's a good, that's a stumper. I'm seeing that we're basically running low on questions. I want to give, oh, here comes Ross from Raincoast. Is anyone aware of who might be trying to secure more resources to deal with barriers in the Lower Fraser? Well, I know we are, Ross, but yeah, if anybody in the chat wants to chime in on that as well, out of all the participants, please do. I know it's a big conversation as part of the economic stimulus funding, that's for sure. And there are various kind of pushes to look at getting that as part of the economic stimulus funding, but it's as yet uncertain, I believe. So that's what I can say. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
Just that's a pretty great fit. Creates jobs, creates long-lasting infrastructure, and benefits to fish. So pretty obvious win if that happens.
Yeah. I want to give just a quick chance for other presenters to ask each other a question about your processes. if you have any ready to go.
I guess I have a question about maybe how Riley's work will fit into the Resilient Waters project, or if there's some collaboration between the two.
That is a good question, Dionne. Riley, do you, maybe I should take the crack at that first, since Resilient Waters is part of it. The question. I guess I would say we've been in touch with Riley since early on, and on our first pass, we've really just been taking more of we've shifted I would say shifted a bit away from a language of prioritization and more towards a language of identifying opportunities, because we knew that we were trying to hit the ground a bit more quickly. And so we took a bit more of a kind of relational approach. And we also understood that a lot of these prioritization tools were being built. So we know we do eventually want to plug into them. In some ways, they may just be to either confirm some of the opportunities we've already found and kind of add an extra layer of information to the sites that we've already are considering, or just help us inform how important that priority or opportunity might be or not. Riley, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that is a kind of a great role for the level of analysis that I'm working at, because it provides kind of a lens through which you can see, what is the ecological opportunity and how cost effective is it, but it doesn't include everything. It doesn't include, who's responsible, how much, we can get a rough idea of cost, but how much exactly does it cost? But it can give you that spatial relationship as well. So, is there opportunity upstream of that barrier removal? Where's the complementarity in these potential projects, and what's the habitat quality like further up in the watershed? So it definitely adds a layer and can be included, but it's not a process in and of itself, much like the Resilient Waters approaches or the approach that Canadian Wildlife Federation might be taking, because it does rely on data already being collected, and then from there we can kind of look at the spatial relationships, look at the habitat quantity and quality, and make some suggestions based on that.
Yeah, definitely. And I understand, I haven't checked this with Nick, so I have chatted with Betty Rebolado, who is also working here in BC with the Canadian Wildlife Federation on fish passage related things. And I think that there is a desire from the Canadian Wildlife Federation to make their tools more available for folks to use. I think you said that in your presentation as well, Nick, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, we would look forward to connecting up with those tools too, just as one more piece of information to add to our understanding.
Absolutely, that's our goal, is to not hold that close to our chest, but to create something that anyone can use.
Yeah, it's great. So we'll be looking forward to getting those when we can, and plugging them in for ourselves. Any other questions from presenters to other presenters? I think what we'll do is we'll push on, because we're just about out of time. So I will just share my screen again. I want to thank all of our presenters, first off, for their great presentations. I'm going to swing us right into another poll for the folks that are still left to help us determine what webinar they'd be most interested in for a future. We don't have any future ones scheduled at this moment, but you'll see on your screens right now a little poll that will help guide us in deciding on a potential future webinar. All right, I'm seeing the results fly in. It's a good mix. All right, I've got 15 results so far. I'll wait for a couple more if anybody's waiting to put theirs in. Okay, it looks like we've got some responses here, so I'll share the results. Looks like effectiveness monitoring, which, yeah, I think that's definitely a good place to go potentially next. And then a lot of interest over all the rest of the subject, so maybe we'll just have to keep going about it like this to help us determine what the next one should be. I will just make sure I capture this. Oh yeah, I think Zoom does capture it for me, so that's good news. Thanks everyone for your input. Oh yes, and I also need to ask you to send me some feedback on this stuff. So I'm going to copy the link in here, put it in the chat. I'll be sending it out via email as well. Where's my chat box? I've got so many windows going on right now. This is tough. Sorry, everyone. There we go. There's my chat box. So here's a feedback form. It won't take too long. Help us inform our next stuff. Finally, just want to thank all of our presenters for coming. Tyrone, Dionne, Kevin, Riley, Nick, that was great. Thanks very much for being here. Thank you to all the participants for being here and keeping the webinars going. Just to say also thanks to our funders, PC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund and Pacific Salmon Foundation. Thanks again. And yeah, feel free to fill out that feedback form. If you have ideas and you hate feedback forms, then just send me an email. That's cool too. So with that, I will sign off a bit early and have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.